August 9th, 1945, 11:55 at night. In an underground bunker beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito sits motionless as 6 men argue about whether Japan should surrender or fight to the last citizen. The room is stifling despite being deep underground, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of an empire collapsing. Above them, American B-29s circle in the darkness, their engines a distant drone that no one in this room acknowledges. For 3 hours, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War has been deadlocked. 3 votes to accept the Potsdam Declaration, with one condition, that the Emperor's position be preserved. 3 votes to fight on with 4 conditions, demands the Americans will never accept. Hirohito has been silent throughout, sitting perfectly still in his military uniform, hands folded in his lap. At 44 years old, he's been emperor for 19 years, a living god in the Shinto tradition, a symbol of an unbroken imperial line stretching back 26 centuries. He has never before intervened directly in a government decision. The entire structure of Japanese governance is designed so that he doesn't have to. He reigns, but does not rule. Ministers decide, generals command, the emperor sanctifies their choices with his presence. But tonight, that structure has failed. The deadlock is absolute. And so Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki does something unprecedented. He turns to Hirohito and asks him directly to break the tie, to make the decision himself, to tell Japan whether it will surrender or fight to annihilation. Hirohito rises slowly. Every man in the room drops to his knees, heads bowed. They cannot look directly at him when he speaks. He stands there for a long moment, and then he begins to talk, his voice thin and high-pitched, speaking in the formal court Japanese that most of his subjects have never heard, would barely understand if they did. "I've given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad," he says, "and have concluded that continuing the war can only mean destruction for the nation and a prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty in the world." His voice wavers. Several witnesses will later report that tears run down his face, though no one in the room is looking up to see. "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer," he continues. "The time has come when we must bear the unbearable." It is 12 minutes past midnight. The decision is made. Japan will surrender. But this moment, this breaking point, has been building for months. The emperor's realization that the war was truly lost didn't arrive in a single revelation. It came in stages, each more crushing than the last, each forcing him to confront truths that his military had hidden, minimized, or simply refused to believe themselves. The first crack appeared in February, 5 months before this midnight conference. Hirohito met with Marquis Koichi Kido, his Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal, the one advisor he trusted completely. Kido brought news from Yalta, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had met to plan the post-war world. The details were fragmentary. Japan's intelligence apparatus was by then nearly blind, but the implications were clear. The Allies were coordinating their final assault. The Soviet Union, which had maintained neutrality with Japan throughout the war, was being courted to join the Pacific conflict. If the Soviets enter the war, Kido said carefully, Manchuria will fall within weeks. The Kwantung Army cannot stop them. Hirohito said nothing, but something in his expression made Kido continue. Your Majesty, the Supreme Command continues to speak of decisive victories on the homeland islands. They believe American casualties in an invasion will force negotiations. But the Americans have shown no indication they will negotiate. And if the Soviets attack from the north while the Americans invade from the south... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Hirohito had been receiving reports. Real reports, not the sanitized summaries the military provided. He knew what had happened at Saipan, where nearly the entire garrison of 30,000 men had died, along with thousands of Japanese civilians who threw themselves off cliffs rather than surrender. He knew about the firebombing of Tokyo in March, which killed over 80,000 people in a single night, more than either atomic bomb would kill. He knew the Navy was finished, the once mighty combined fleet reduced to scattered remnants, hiding in ports, unable to sortie without being sunk. Continue to explore possibilities for peace, Hirohito told Kido. Through the Soviets if necessary. It was the first time he had explicitly authorized peace overtures, but even then, he couldn't quite bring himself to say the word surrender. The possibility still existed in his mind that Japan might negotiate from a position of strength, that one more victory, one more demonstration of Japanese resolve, might convince the Americans to soften their terms. That hope died at Okinawa. The battle for Okinawa lasted 82 days, from April through June. It was the last major island before the Japanese home islands, and the military had promised Hirohito it would be the decisive battle that would break American will. Over 100,000 Japanese troops defended the island. They would fight to the last man, inflict such horrific casualties that the Americans would recoil from the prospect of invading Japan itself. The reports Hirohito received in April were optimistic. Kamikaze attacks were sinking American ships at unprecedented rates. Ground forces were conducting a defense in depth that was bleeding the American advance. Victory was not certain, but the Americans were suffering. By May, the tone had shifted. Casualties were mounting, but the Americans kept coming. The kamikaze pilots were running out. Not running out of volunteers, but running out of planes, running out of fuel, running out of experienced pilots who could actually hit their targets. The defense in depth was collapsing into a simple retreat southward, each defensive line breaking faster than the last. By June, Okinawa was lost. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers dead, 12,000 American dead, 36,000 wounded. The ratio was nearly 10-1 in Japanese deaths, and still the Americans had won. They had absorbed those casualties and kept advancing, and now they had an island just 350 miles from Kyushu, the southernmost home island. Air bases were already being constructed. The invasion was coming. Hirohito summoned the Supreme Council in June and asked them directly, "What is the plan if the Americans invade the homeland?" The answer was Operation Ketsugo, the decisive battle for Japan itself. Every able-bodied man and woman would be mobilized. Civilians would fight with bamboo spears if necessary. Kamikaze attacks would be launched not just from planes, but from boats, from submarines, from swimmers with explosives strapped to their backs. The entire nation would become a weapon. American casualties would be so catastrophic that they would have no choice but to negotiate. "And Japanese casualties?" Hirohito asked. The military leaders looked at each other. Finally, War Minister Korechika Anami spoke. "The people are prepared to sacrifice everything for the emperor." Hirohito understood what that meant. Millions dead, tens of millions. The complete destruction of Japanese civilization in exchange for the possibility, not the certainty, the possibility, that America might agree to terms that preserved the imperial system. He authorized continued preparation for Ketsugo, because what else could he do? To openly oppose it would be to break the fundamental structure of his role. The emperor did not command. He did not overrule his ministers and generals. He sanctified their decisions. To do otherwise would be to admit that he was not a symbol, but a ruler, not a god, but a man. And if he was just a man, then what was the point of any of this? What had all these deaths been for? But privately, he told Kido to intensify peace feelers. Approach the Soviets. See if they would mediate. Offer concessions. Not surrender, never surrender, but perhaps a return to pre-war borders, perhaps reparations, perhaps something that would end this without the annihilation of everything. The Soviets said nothing. They were stalling, and Hirohito knew it, but he clung to the hope anyway because hope was all he had left. Then came August 6th. The first report was confused. An American bomber had dropped something on Hiroshima. The entire city was destroyed. Not firebombed, destroyed in an instant. Communications were cut off. Estimates of casualties ranged from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. No one knew what had happened. By August 7th, the truth was emerging. A single bomb. One bomb had done what previously required hundreds of bombers and thousands of incendiary devices. The Americans called it an atomic bomb. Japanese scientists had theorized about such weapons but concluded they were impossible to build, or at least impossible to build in time to effect this war. They had been wrong. Hirohito met with his military leaders on August 7th. "If they have one such bomb," he said, "they likely have more. How many cities can we afford to lose this way?" The answer came faster than anyone expected. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. 70,000 dead, this time in a city that hadn't even been the primary target. The bomber had been aiming for Kokura, but found it obscured by clouds, so they hit their secondary target instead. 70,000 people dead because of weather, but even this wasn't what broke Hirohito's last hope. What broke it came the same day, hours after Nagasaki, when the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of Japanese military might, collapsed within days. Soviet forces poured across the border with overwhelming superiority in tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The Japanese defenders, stripped of their best units and equipment over years of war, fell back in chaos. Within a week, the Soviets would advance over 500 miles, would overrun Japanese positions that were supposed to hold for months. The two-front war that Hirohito had feared since February was now reality. The Americans would invade from the south with their atomic bombs and their inexhaustible industrial might. The Soviets would invade from the north with their massive army. Japan would be caught between them, ground to dust. And still, the Supreme Council was deadlocked. The military faction, War Minister Anami, Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, Navy Chief of Staff Suimu Toyoda, insisted that Japan must fight on. They argued that the atomic bombs were a terror weapon but not a military game-changer, that America couldn't have many more, that the Soviet invasion of Manchuria was irrelevant because the homeland defense didn't depend on Manchuria. They proposed 4 conditions for peace: preservation of the imperial system, no occupation of the homeland. Japanese forces would disarm themselves, and war criminals would be tried by Japanese courts. The peace faction: Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, and Prime Minister Suzuki, argued that these conditions were fantasy. The Americans had already made clear that surrender must be unconditional. The only negotiating point they might accept was preservation of the emperor, and even that wasn't certain. Every day of delay meant more cities destroyed, more people killed, and the very real possibility that the Americans would decide the emperor himself was a war criminal who needed to be removed. 3 votes to 3 votes. Deadlock. They met on the morning of August 9th. They met again that afternoon. They met again that evening. The arguments went in circles. The military faction insisted that Japan still had millions of soldiers, that the spirit of the people was unbreakable, that one decisive battle on the home islands would change everything. The peace faction pointed to Okinawa, to the atomic bombs, to the Soviet invasion, to the complete absence of any indication that America would negotiate. At 11:45 p.m., they moved to the underground bunker for an Imperial conference. Hirohito would be present, but by tradition, he would not speak unless asked. The 6 council members would present their positions to him, but the expectation was that they would reach a decision among themselves. The emperor's role was to witness and sanctify, not to choose. But they couldn't reach a decision. The same arguments, the same deadlock. Midnight passed. August 10th began. The discussion continued. Finally, at 12 minutes past midnight, Prime Minister Suzuki did what no prime minister had done in the modern era. He asked the emperor directly to make the decision. The room fell silent. Every man present understood what this meant. If the emperor chose surrender, he would be responsible for the greatest humiliation in Japanese history. If he chose to fight on, he would be responsible for whatever came next. The deaths, the destruction, the possible extinction of the Japanese people. The entire structure of imperial governance was designed to prevent him from ever having to make such a choice, to preserve his sacred status by keeping him above the realm of decisions and consequences. That structure had failed. The decision was his. Hirohito stood, and the 6 men dropped to their knees. He spoke for 5 minutes, his voice breaking several times. He said he had concluded that continuing the war would mean the destruction of the nation. He said he could not bear to see his people suffer any longer. He said that the military had promised victory at Saipan, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, and each time the result had been the same: annihilation of Japanese forces and continued American advance. He said that the atomic bombs represented a new level of threat that Japan had no defense against. He said that the Soviet invasion removed any possibility of negotiated peace through Moscow. "Oh no, I cannot endure the thought of letting my people suffer any longer," he said. His voice was barely audible. "The time has come when we must bear the unbearable." He sat down. The decision was made. Japan would accept the Potsdam Declaration with one condition: that the emperor's position be preserved. The room remained silent for a long moment after he finished speaking. Then War Minister Anami, who had argued most forcefully for continuing the fight, spoke quietly. "I will abide by His Majesty's decision." It was over, but not quite. The decision had been made, but it still had to be implemented, and that proved almost as difficult as making the decision itself. The surrender message had to be transmitted to the Allies through neutral Switzerland and Sweden. The response had to be waited for. And most crucially, the Japanese people had to be told, and for that, Hirohito would have to do something no emperor had ever done: speak directly to his subjects over the radio. The recording session was scheduled for August 14th in the Imperial Household Ministry building. Hirohito arrived wearing his military uniform, the same one he had worn during the midnight conference. A recording engineer from NHK, Japan's national broadcaster, had set up equipment in a small room. The plan was to record the emperor reading the Imperial rescript on the termination of the war, then broadcast it the following day at noon. The engineer was terrified. He had been told only that morning what he would be recording. He had never been in the presence of the emperor before. He wasn't allowed to look directly at Hirohito. His hands shook as he set up the microphone. Hirohito sat down and began to read. His voice was thin and reedy, speaking in formal court Japanese that most of his subjects would struggle to understand. The language was archaic, full of classical Chinese phrases and imperial terminology that hadn't been used in everyday speech for centuries. He spoke of having declared war on America and Britain to ensure Japan's self-preservation and the stabilization of East Asia. He spoke of the war situation developing, not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He spoke of the enemy employing a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage was incalculable. The engineer stopped him. The recording quality wasn't good enough. They needed to do it again. Hirohito read it again and again. Multiple takes, each time reading the same carefully crafted words that explained surrender without ever using that word. The Imperial rescript never said defeat or surrender. It said Japan would accept the provisions of the joint declaration and endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. Between takes, Hirohito's composure cracked. Several witnesses later reported that he wept openly, something they had never seen before, something they hadn't imagined was possible. the living God crying like a man. The final recording was completed after midnight on August 15th. The engineer carefully packed the records, 2 copies, in case one was damaged, into a small box. They were taken to the Imperial Household Ministry safe to be kept until the broadcast at noon. But even then, it wasn't over. A group of army officers, led by Major Kenji Hatanaka, attempted a coup. They believed the surrender decision was a betrayal orchestrated by weak civilian ministers who had deceived the emperor. Their plan was to seize the imperial palace, find and destroy the recording, and prevent the surrender broadcast. They would then issue orders in the emperor's name to continue the war. The coup attempt began around 2 a.m. on August 15th. Hatanaka and his co-conspirators convinced the commander of the 1st Imperial Guards Division to support them, then used forged orders to mobilize troops. They occupied the palace grounds, cut the phone lines, and began searching for the recording. For several hours, they ransacked the Imperial Household Ministry building, going through offices and safes. They interrogated staff members, demanding to know where the recording was hidden. They never found it. The safe it was locked in looked like just another piece of furniture, and no one they interrogated knew its location. By dawn, the coup was collapsing. Senior army commanders learned what was happening and ordered the troops to stand down. The commander of the Eastern District Army, General Shizuichi Tanaka, arrived at the palace and personally ordered the rebel troops to return to their barracks. Most obeyed immediately, confused about why they had been mobilized in the first place. Major Hatanaka and his core conspirators realized they had failed. Around dawn, Hatanaka shot himself in the head in the palace plaza. Several other conspirators committed suicide over the following hours. War Minister Anami, who had known about the coup plot but refused to either support or betray it, committed ritual seppuku at his home, leaving a note that said simply, "Believing firmly that our sacred land shall never perish, I, with my death, humbly apologize to the emperor for the great crime." The recording survived. At noon on August 15th, 1945, every radio in Japan broadcast the same message. Air raid sirens sounded to alert people that something important was about to happen. Millions of Japanese stopped what they were doing and gathered around radios in homes, in public squares, in factories and offices. Then came the voice, high-pitched and formal, speaking in language most of them barely understood. But they understood enough. The war was over. Japan had lost. Many people wept. Some collapsed. In the Imperial Palace Plaza, hundreds of citizens gathered and prostrated themselves, pressing their foreheads to the ground. Some committed suicide rather than face the shame of defeat. But most simply stood there in shock, trying to process what they had just heard. The voice of God telling them that the divine wind had failed, that the empire was broken, that everything they had believed and sacrificed for had come to nothing. Hirohito himself spent that day in his private quarters, seeing no one. What he thought, what he felt, no one recorded. The man who had broken the deadlock, who had made the decision that no emperor was supposed to make, was alone with the consequences. In the days that followed, he met with his advisors to plan what came next. The Americans would arrive soon to begin the occupation. There were questions about whether he would be tried as a war criminal, whether the imperial system would be preserved at all. Everything was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The man who had been raised to be a living god, who had reigned but never ruled, had in the end been forced to rule. He had made the decision that ended the war, and in doing so, he had transformed himself from symbol into man. The weight of that transformation, the knowledge that he had chosen surrender, that he had been the one to say the war was truly lost, that would be his burden for the rest of his life. Years later, after the occupation, after the war crimes trials that notably did not include him, after Japan's reconstruction and transformation into a peaceful democracy, Hirohito would occasionally be asked about the surrender decision. He never spoke about it in detail. The official line was always that he had simply made the decision that his advisors had been unable to make, that he had acted to save his people from further suffering. But those who were in that underground bunker on the night of August 9th, who heard his voice break as he spoke of bearing the unbearable, they knew the truth. The emperor who learned the war was truly lost didn't just accept that fact and move on. He broke, he wept, he transformed from symbol into human being under the weight of that knowledge. And in that transformation, in that moment of breaking, he found the strength to do what symbols cannot do. Make a choice, the hardest choice, the choice that saved millions of lives by ending the war, but also the choice that ended the myth of imperial infallibility that revealed the god to be a man. "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer," he had said. "Not my subjects, not the Japanese people. My innocent people." The words of a man who had finally, after years of carefully maintained distance, after years of being a symbol rather than a ruler, allowed himself to feel the weight of what was happening to those he was supposed to protect. That was what the emperor said when he learned the war was truly lost. Not a grand pronouncement, not a defiant vow, just the quiet, broken admission that he could not bear to see them suffer anymore, that the time had come to bear the unbearable. And in saying those words, in making that choice, Hirohito did something more difficult than winning a war. He ended one. He chose life over honor, survival over glory, reality over myth. He learned that being human, with all its weakness and pain and terrible responsibility, was harder than being a god.